When I first moved to the wilderness in the southern Colorado mountains some 30 years ago, I did not know that in the years that lied ahead, I would be a witness to the obscene and brutal elimination of certain species that had roamed these mountains for centuries. Nor did I know that I would regularly have to measure my response to defend myself and my property to the animal responsible for this sacrilege to the environment. And as some of you might have guessed already, the creature I am talking about that laid waste to the environment did not walk the forest on four legs. It was, of course, man. And my first encounter with one of the men who terrorized this ecosystem came early my first spring. I was walking on one of the rough, rocky roads that bordered my land that was four-wheel drive under the best of conditions with my dog when I heard a truck slowly coming up the road from a long, long way away. You could hear a vehicle coming for well over a mile away. Now, I could have easily walked off the road into the woods undetected, but I was not of that mind in those early days. But that would change over time. And as the truck approached me and came to a stop, I also stopped and turned around to see who it was and meet and introduce myself to whoever it may be, considering this was way back off the beaten path. The driver jumped out of the truck very aggressively, armed with a rifle, and quickly leveled that rifle at me from about 20 feet. And then he shouted, "What are you doing back here?" and that this is all private property. I calmly told him that I was out for a walk with my dog. I assumed that that was obvious. He kept his rifle pointed at me and demanded that I leave the area. I told him I was a property owner and had been for years, and that in fact my property was right there as I pointed off to my side. He then lowered his weapon and said, "Well, we got a bad poaching situation going on out here. I thought you'd be a poacher." I thought that was a very strange accusation, considering I was dressed about like how I am here in just shorts and a tank top and some hiking boots with my dog and absolutely nothing else. So that startled me to some degree. And after him trying to convince me that we all had to be on the lookout for poachers, he drove away. And that was the last time that I would walk the road and let myself be seen. In fact, from that day forward, I would never let myself be seen on the roads again. If I was walking on the road and heard a vehicle approaching, I would just disappear into the forest, unseen, but watching and learning. The north side of my property had a beautiful seasonal creek that would sometimes run over a foot deep as the spring snows melted. And there were some majestic cottonwood trees that lined the creek bed. And at the base of one of those trees was a hole burrowed deep underneath the base of it and intertwined with large roots that almost looked like a gate covering the hole. And although there was still some snow on the ground, I could see some small animal footprints leading in and out of that hole that went underneath this huge cottonwood tree. This was a home of some creature. So I started watching this hole from a long ways away, over 100 yards, where I had the uphill advantage of looking down but staying undetected. And I wanted to know what lived in such a magnificent place. It was just so amazing. And never getting any closer than that 100 yards during my surveillance from a higher point, I would sit and watch quietly. It took over a week and many hours of silent observation before I got my first peek. One early morning at my watching post, a gray fox caught my eye moving 50 yards away from the hole with a dead rabbit in its mouth, and slowly and methodically and cautiously looking all around as it got closer to the entrance. Then it darted into the hole at the base of that tree. That's what was living there. I was satisfied with that knowledge, amazed at the patience and time it took to see that. Gray fox were extremely rare already in these mountains, although they were fairly plentiful. To ever see one, you could had to consider yourself very lucky. Very lucky. I had observed many red fox before, but seeing the elusive rare gray fox was a treat I will never forget. I didn't know then that that was the first and last gray fox I would ever see. And for the following week after that first observation, I took my morning coffee every morning at my little observation post with my binoculars and my dog sitting quietly by my side, and always in anticipation of seeing that fox again. And I did see him a couple of times briefly over the next week. And then about 4 or 5 days of watching this activity, uh, on one morning, I zeroed in with my binoculars, and it looked like the fox was dead, laying outside of its den, not far from its den, maybe 20 feet. It was hard for me to tell with my binoculars exactly what was happening there, but I just sat there for a while thinking that that's what I was seeing. And then right when I was thinking that's what I was seeing, I could hear a truck coming down the back road. So I just sat there and watched, and a truck pulled over. Guy got out of his truck. It was the same person I had encountered earlier that I described. And he came out and picked that fox up and cut it out of a snare trap and walked away after he tossed it into the back of his truck. I really had a sickening feeling. Completely disturbed by what I had seen, I kept watching that after he drove away. I never revealed myself. I was just observing and learning and keeping this information to myself. And after he drove away, sometime later, maybe about a half an hour, I saw 3 or 4 little fox babies come out of that hole, wandering around and sniffing. They could have probably not even been weaned. They were so small. And that day was the last day I ever saw gray fox. And it was those little babies and the dead mother being carted away. And the thing that was the hardest for me to understand was this had all taken place on my property. And I had hiked up that back road many times to see how a couple of the people that were only seasonal back in there at this elevation, I was the only person living year round at that altitude. But come springtime, there were a few seasonal cabins where some people would come in, and this particular person was one of those that only came in when the snows were melting, and he could get up his road and throughout the summer. And I had gone out there, and his property was lined with anyone caught trespassing type signs will be shot on sight. You know, that kind of rhetoric and dialogue. So, yeah, here he was trespassing on my property and killing wildlife. So, from that point forward, I became the observer of much activity in these parts, always out in the woods. Every time I would hear something, I would get to vantage points where I could observe what was going on. Many seasons passed, many more winters, many more springs when these trappers would roll in, and I learned an awful lot. And yeah, I have a hard time coming up with the right words to say about all of this, but many, many more years of this type of activity. All the great black squirrels that were in my neighborhood, of course, rabbits, anything that could be trapped would be trapped indiscriminately, abundantly. I saw 55-gallon drums in the backs of some of these trucks full of dead animals, and they were selling their skins. Uh, it was just really appalling. And of course, as I saw lots of the small game disappear over the years, it affected the entire ecosystem. You know, it was just it's hard to have the words for it. Anyway, I could witness a lot. So after many years, I certainly learned who was responsible for this. I learned how to track animals myself. I would watch their game trails. And in this particular picture right here, there's only one animal that leaves a track like that through the snow, where it looks like just 1 foot in front of the other. And that's a lion. And the lions were hunted to the point where even living back in these parts full time, 100%, you'd be lucky to ever see a mountain lion. They were so elusive, but they were trapped indiscriminately as well. And this is just right off my own driveway. I would see these lion tracks every morning. You know, they would come in at night and sniff around. And this is before anybody was using game trail cameras or surveillance cameras of any kind. This was long before those days. So you would just step out your door and see we had a visitor last night. And I would often hike along these trails to see what it would lead to. And a trail like this would inevitably lead to like a deer kill where the mountain lion had caught a deer along some of the game trails, and you would see what was left of the deer. And that was just the natural order of how nature was working. All the trapping that was going on, I found all kinds of traps on my property. I always disabled them and destroyed them. There were claw traps, snare traps, lots of various traps, and I was getting to where I could hear these people coming. I could watch them set the traps, and within minutes of them leaving, I would go down and disable and destroy anything that was on my property. And my beloved mountain dog, Odie, who would always, when we would be hiking around and things that I could not see, he could sniff them out, and he would often point out to me where these dead trapped animals were. He finally died. Miss him tremendously. Great dog. And then the story continues. And right when Odie was getting older and slowing down, I got myself a Great Pyrenees pup at only 8 weeks old. And this is Booger. And Booger was a mighty dog, weighed about 130 pounds, huge. And his favorite toy, we used to say, was a pack of coyotes. He really kept the coyotes and the bears fairly at bay, especially the coyotes. Now, the bears could always push him back when they wanted to come in and get a chicken dinner. Of course, I raised a lot of chickens and turkeys and stuff for my own meat. And he could largely keep everything away, or at least alert me to the fact that something was going on. And it was what happened with Booger on a December night where it was so traumatic that I had to come to an understanding with these people that I had been trying to live with for years, largely having to ignore their activities unless it was encroaching upon my property, which it often did. But yeah, I'm going to cover that in a part 2 because it deserves a part 2. So that's the Booger Man. And on a December night, he was instrumental in changing the poaching activity that was happening around me. I had been pushed far enough, and I had been pushed too far over the years. And in part two, we'll have the story of Booger and how I was able to, for once and for all, make this situation cease around me anyway. All right, everybody. I'll catch you on part two. Aloha.